It was as if the cosmos itself quaked under the frenzied forward movement of us humans. Giant warships surrounded whole star clusters, blocking every wormhole and warp corridor behind impenetrable barriers. The alien warlords, who had once ruled hundreds of worlds, found that there was no way out, and the big payoff was approaching. It was a maneuver the galaxy had never seen before. The alien empire, the sovereigns, had gone unchecked for centuries, subjugating lesser races and expanding its territory across an untold number of star systems. Now, though, a massive human fleet surrounded the entirety of the empire, sealing off every wormhole and hyperspace corridor with adamantine blockades. No ship could flee, and for the first time in living memory, the sovereigns were trapped. To the capital Arith Beta, Overlord Vos the Ladris met his high conclave in an immense chamber, lined and draped with the banners of their all-but-forgotten, centuries-old victory. Normally, his voice possessed a proud confidence, but that certainty cracked as reports came flooding in. Entire border provinces isolated, frantic requests for reinforcements, trade routes evaporating overnight. Could humanity, long thought of as a lesser power, have really planned this massive attack? Admiral Cassandra Holt studied a tactical map displaying the domains of the sovereigns at the helm of the human flagship, the Resolute Dawn. Every blockade station was marked by red icons, their mounts bristling with enough weaponry to intercept even the most hesitantly made jump through the warp. She recalled the years spent in secret while building a network of allies, reverse engineering the stolen technology and mapping every weak point in the Empire's defenses. The blockade was only the opening move of a calculated plan to break the Empire from within. Across sovereign space, ripples of shock went out among citizens and conquered worlds. They had never known their rulers to be invincible. Now they were watched a whole fleet seal the Empire's exits with eerie efficiency. Governors on far-flung colonies rushed to fortify defenses, and supply lines started to falter. Desperate speculation flew that there was perhaps some superweapon, some concealed path past the blockade, but nothing materialized. Vos the Ladris's steely demeanor, so unflappable for much of the crisis, frayed with each unfolding account. The Empire's war machine had faced little serious opposition in the past, and the size of humanity's operation loomed large. His aides squabbled about potential responses. Some called for all-out retaliation, others demanded negotiation, a concept long anathema to an empire that has built itself on subjugation. But time was short, and the blockade remained firm. On the bridge of the Resolute Dawn, Admiral Holt gave her orders with a determination that would not soon be forgotten. The blockade would shift positions, rotate on concentric rings, surrounding each star system more closely. Gravity nets frustrated warp drives, quantum jammers muted communications. If the sovereigns tried to break out, they would face overwhelming force. Every single step had been shaken out in full simulation. All contingencies had been robustly modeled. The humans knew the dangers. If they failed, the Empire's counterstrike could be calamitous. But they could not fail. Too many worlds had endured the sovereign's ruthless domination. Fear and confusion mingled in city after city throughout the Empire. Could these upstart humans really topple a power that had endured for generations? Some, scalded by oppression, dreamed the blockade might usher liberation. Others worried that humanity's victory would only substitute one master for another. Yet the blockade was a brutal reminder. The sovereigns were not all-powerful. In the background, human strategists scanned the Empire's infrastructure, looking for weak points to hit next. They would strangle the sovereigns of resources and isolate their fleets before a single shot was fired in earnest. Skittish human corvettes scoured supply routes, strategic depots abruptly quarantined. The blockade was not just a simple wall, but a clinical instrument of pressure which could grind down even the most stubborn enemy in time. That pressure mounted daily, eating at the corners of sovereign morale. The admirals, once proud of their service, wondered if they were ready for a conflict of this magnitude. Ordinary citizens struggled with shortages of basic goods after supply convoys failed to arrive. It struck terror into the hearts of billions to discover that there was no escape from this galactic cage. Nevertheless, Vos the Ladris would not concede. Summoning what pride he could, he vowed that the Empire would resist. Summons went out for every warship to rally over critical systems. Factories pumped out weapons with frenzied urgency. The High Conclave, declaring a state of total war, vowed to avenge humanity for this audacious attack. But all this bravado masked an uncomfortable truth. The sovereigns had never prepared for the idea that they would be in a corner. Admiral Holt and her officers, in the meantime, were unapologetic. The blockade was the end result of decades of planning, a grim necessity to stave off further atrocities. Every passing hour brought them nearer to the following stage, a decisive campaign to hit the Empire's heart as soon as the blockade had sapped its strength. Humanity had not arrived in pursuit of conquest. They had come to bring one to an end. As the blockade continued, the galaxy held its breath. Sovereigns of millions of worlds trapped in cages. The human siege was so relentless that the most dogged loyalists felt the Empire's grip loosen. In every corner of sovereign space, hope and dread coiled like serpents. Should humanity win, a new age would begin in the galaxy. If the sovereigns broke loose, they would retaliate with a fury rarely witnessed. And thus, with the tension rising and time slipping away, the stage was prepared for a collision that would change the constellations for all eternity. But even as the sovereigns struggled against their encirclement, humanity knew how big of a risk it was taking. Billions of lives hung on the success of the blockade, and an entire generation of human soldiers had trained for this very mission, bearing the hopes of the worlds ravaged by the Empire's conquests. Their orders had been precise: hold the blockade at all costs, and demonstrate that the sovereign's cruelty would no longer dominate the galaxy without fear of reprisal. No one could say how long this standstill would endure. Maybe the sovereigns would strike out in a desperate attempt to break the blockade, or an internal coup would bring about a change of power within the Empire. But for now, the humans had all the exits, preparing to deliver a final reckoning to the formerly invincible tyrants that thought no terrorizing force in the cosmos would ever lose them. History was about to be rewritten, and every star in the blockade watched in silence as an empire fell, and humanity boldly marched into the pages of legend. The undercurrent of tension ran throughout every corner of the besieged empire. Near distant worlds on the blockade's edge, sovereign admirals beheld the spectacle in grim silence. Human patrols repositioning themselves methodically, ships sweeping through star lanes to draw the noose ever more closely with mechanical precision. Even surrounded and isolated from outside reinforcements, however, the alien armada was no joke. Its hundreds of thousands of warships, each armed to the teeth with the most advanced weapons, had conquered countless civilizations, creating an empire that few thought could ever fall. Admiral Cronus Thar, battle-hardened tactician of the Sovereigns, stood on the command deck of the dreadnought Vengeance of Arith, watching his own massive task force. Towering on a raised dais, he listened to the endless babble of his crew, reports of resource depletion, requests from outlying garrisons, snatches of human corvettes dancing into ranges of his sensors. A quiet rage reverberated in the deck under him. The blockade identified the Sovereign's idealism as cowardly and hypocritical, and was also an affront to all that they stood for. Admiral Thar took a measured breath and readied a string of orders. If he was able to coordinate a decisive strike, maybe he could break the blockade in one sector, allowing his warships to pour through and break the encirclement. These aspirations, though, collided with the humans' meticulous planning. Admiral Holt already had his fleets one step ahead, a systematic interdiction of every known warp vector. Their warships were well spread, an adaptive net that could redeploy upon any sign of a large-scale breakout. Certainly, intelligence drawn from erstwhile vassal states had taught humanity that an empire the size of the Sovereigns was dependent on the illusion of invincible might. Now, the humans were hoping to prove that the slow starvation of an empire's supply lines could bring down the most formidable conquerors. And this is how the battle lines, though quiet for now, were drawn. Small sovereign detachments probed the perimeter, skirmishing with isolated ships across the blockade. In one case, a group of alien frigates tried to make a fast warp jump from the Oryx Belt system, a dense field of asteroids in which waxy supply caches are rumored to be hidden. Long before they could penetrate through the blockade, human corvettes dropped stealth, ghosting between the rocks of the field with thrusters tuned to micro-precision. The corvettes deployed gravitic mines that scrambled the warp field, leaving the Sovereign frigates helpless in the vacuum. A moment later, the Resolute Dawn's artillery batteries rumbled through the vacuum, blasting the trapped ships into drifting wreckage. When news of this union reached the High Conclave, an uneasy hush settled in the chamber. If even secretive escapes were unattainable, how could the Empire ever hope to elude its enemy? In the face of these losses, the Sovereigns have held on to defiance. They released a frantic series of countermeasures, growing more transgressive with each new one. For the volcanic world of Cattle Prime, scientists accelerated the development of a gravity bore cannon meant to punch a temporary rift through the blockade. On Arith Beta, Vostaladris authorized a Black Ops mission to penetrate human lines in order to disable the blockade's jamming grids and make a path for escape. But at each turn, the humans always seemed to know about these plans. Parties sent to board and sabotage command centers were ambushed by waiting human marines. Artillery prototypes suffered catastrophic malfunctions because of the Empire's rush for hasty results. The Sovereign's infamous efficiency crumbled under the relentless strain of confinement. Human strategists, for their part, thrived in this state of controlled chaos. They tracked every change in Sovereign activity from hidden mobile command posts. Whenever an alien sector mobilized for a breakout, some of the warships of the blockade would silently congeal, forcing the Sovereigns to stand down before colliding with impossible numbers. This war of positioning was an enormous strain on the alien fleets, forcing them to waste valuable stores of fuel in their desperate attempts to find loopholes in humanity's net. In the Empire's core worlds, the sense of doom only intensified. Though their back-end scouting missions and calculated raids had failed, the Sovereigns would not give over control of their own destiny. Overlord Vostaladris, after long contemplation, sanctioned a large coordinated attack that would test the blockading force's fortitude on such many fronts. One thing was for sure. If even a single sector were to fall, it was likely the Sovereigns would re-establish contact with off-corp pirates or distant vassal states to their purpose. In the war room on Arith Beta, a starship whippet-size that had a holographic star map filling an entire vaulted ceiling, Sovereign admirals plotted the multifaceted assault. Attacks by waves of cruisers and battleships would come from 3 distant sectors. A fourth, more stealthy insertion would try to disable a crucial relay in humanity's sensor grid, possibly blinding that section of the blockade. The plan was large in scale and short on hope. All available warships were pressed into service. The logistical pressure, however, was apparent. Fuel and munitions stockpiles were depleted, and some of the Empire's vessels on the front lines had already started to strip each other of parts. But to the High Conclave, anything was better than surrender. Little did Vostaladris know, however, that human intelligence had already caught wind of the plan. Long ago, spies seated deep inside the Empire's military machinery sent coded alerts back to Admiral Holt, who had the blockade readied. The tension within the human ranks reached fever pitch. It would be the biggest clash since the siege started, and the toll in lives could be staggering. Yet morale remained high. The fleet at large hoped that the Sovereign's fall would free unnumbered species and end generations of repression. At the appointed hour, the Empire set loose its assault. The first spike came from the direction of the Kalos Drift, an area of space with raging cosmic dust storms. Hidden from view of the storms, hundreds of Sovereign destroyers pushed forward, weapon systems coming online for a brutal head-on confrontation. The human battleships answered in kind, responding with punchy salvos that lit the dust clouds in bursts of color. Outmatched, the humans teetered on the brink of being overwhelmed, until hidden squadrons of corvettes flanked the attacking force, sending chaos through the Sovereign lines. Missiles flew through the mayhem. The battle raged for hours, and a graveyard of twisted hulls drifted in the storm. At the same time, the second wave swirled around the red sun of Helion 7. There, the Sovereigns had planned to take advantage of gravitational anomalies to slip past the blockade's warp disruption fields. The effort stumbled almost before it began. Cruisers of human interdiction equipped with advanced sensor masking took by surprise the invading fleet with torpedo strikes that never stopped. What could have been a rapid breakaway turned into another stalemate, eroding the Empire's already strained fleets further. The third attack targeted the strategic Havelock Passage, a narrow corridor of space studded with human armaments. Sovereigns flung dreadnoughts at, frantically trying to joke them through. A deluge of drones and other fighter craft poured into the void in a beautiful array of lights and explosions. Yet the blockade held. A coordinated strike from mass drivers, railguns, and laser batteries broke apart the alien dreadnoughts, piece by piece, over time. Slowly, ship by ship, the sovereign line crumbled, retreating to the safety of fortified positions further within their territory. But the biggest threat came from the Empire's secret insertion. A crack commando team, selected personally by Vastaladris, had tried to storm a critical array station that had been orbiting the broken body of a moon. This station's sensor network, if disabled, would render a segment of the blockade blind to warp signatures. For a brief time, it looked like the plan could work. The commandos slipped through perimeter defenses, cracking access codes with terrifying efficiency. But at the last gate, they found a squad of human marines waiting. The station's corridors echoed with the sound of blaster fire as the infiltration team fought to the last. When their failures spread to the farthest reaches of the Empire, fear gripped the populace. A final confrontation loomed, but the odds had been stacked firmly in humanity's favor, with the sovereigns on the verge of collapse. Admiral Cassandra Holt stared at incoming feeds of intelligence from the command deck of the Resolute Dawn. Flashing lights indicated the reduced condition of the sovereign fleets after their failed assaults. Even though humanity had endured expensive losses, the blockade remained in place, and the enemy's desperation was obvious. Hundreds of star systems were dominated by Titanic battleships now lifeless over empty orbital platforms, their fuel and supplies long gone, and the war in its final death throes. Where sovereign admirals had once spoken with absolute certainty of their invincibility, reports now had recounted frantic resource grabs and crew desertions. But despite the fact that their situation got worse by the minute, the sovereigns had not given up. Vastaladris himself had gone mute, declining to comment publicly. Rumors seeped through the blockade's intelligence network. Some said he had holed up inside the High Conclave's fortress. Others murmured that he was mounting a last stand at the capital. The truth is that no one could say where he was. Even so, Admiral Holt and her command staff were both in agreement on one thing. The Empire's leadership was at the brink of dissolution, but a wounded beast would still fight for every tooth with bloodied venom. Inside the human fleet, the tension was high, but hopes were higher. The blockade had been more successful than many had predicted, kneecapping the Empire's military mobility and splitting its scattered forces from one another. Now, the most perilous phase of the operation arrived, the inward push. Up to this point, humanity had enforced a clear perimeter, only engaging those who attempted to cross it. But moving to a more aggressive approach would risk engaging directly with the Empire's strongest defensive strongholds. But if it waits too long, the sovereigns could have time to consolidate or rally behind some desperate gambit. Admiral Holt called forth a council of her senior officers to a secure briefing room deep within the Resolute Dawn. Transparent holographic star maps hung in the air, each one dotted with glowing points marking key sovereign outposts. Her voice was calm, but urgency seeped into each word as she spoke to the gathered captains. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come further than anyone thought possible. We've demonstrated that even the mightiest empire can be in a cage. But just caging it is not victory. We have to press on, take apart their last bastions, and give the sovereigns no opportunity to mend. Expect intense resistance. They'll have nothing to lose. Murmurs of agreement swept through the chamber. In earlier months, such a daring plan could have appeared suicidal. But with the blockade still in place and details of the sovereigns' widespread depletion confirmed by intel, a push toward the core systems seemed not just feasible but required. The first targets had been found, a chain of strategic bastions that functioned as shield generators and missile platforms for the Empire's capital region. These installations covered critical approach corridors to Arith Beta, the imperial seat of power. If humanity's fleets could disable them, the last step, to address the High Conclave directly, would be vastly easier. If the operation failed, however, the blockade might still hold, but the opportunity to deliver a decisive blow to the Empire would be lost. As part of the upcoming offensive, human engineers retrofitted two of the most crucial flagships with a newly developed disruptor cannon, a device that could generate pulses that destabilized the powerful shielding of the sovereign's ships. Workers toiled in shifts around the clock, driven by the same unyielding resolve that had kept the blockade so woefully effective. Skirmishers drilled for boarding actions. Whispers told of the ultimate goal. If Vastaladris would not do battle upon the plains, they would take the Conclave's citadel, house by house, street by street, from within. Orders flowed across the blockade. Selected fleets would detach from their perimeter stations and merge at designated rally points, leaving enough ships to ensure that none of the craft forming the breakout attempted to slip between them. It was a risk, albeit a careful one. Taking ships away from the blockade could create small, isolated openings, but the consensus in intelligence was that the sovereigns no longer had the coordinated strength to exploit such opportunities. But after pouring everything into a failed counteroffensive, their fleets lay scattered and battered. And yet, there remained pockets of stubborn resistance. The world of Syraxis Prime could still be a bastion of the Indomitus Crusade, but one called to a dark trial to breach. Veiled by a maze of synthetic storm clouds and safeguarded by overlapping planetary shields, Syraxis Prime teamed with the most devoted and zealous of the Sovereign's forces. Intercepted transmissions identified an influential warlord, Rashgahar, who maintained a huge garrison there and had rejected all orders to fall back. If humanity wanted a clear path to Arith Beta, they needed to take Syraxis Prime. The attack on Syraxis Prime commenced at dawn, local time. Dreadnoughts had ascended to high orbit, methodically pouring bombardment into the shield network whilst frigates and corvettes hounded the surface of the planet to suppress anti-air turrets. The atmosphere was charged with discharges of energy as corrosive forces beat against her shields. Admiral Holt monitored the live feed from her command center, brow furrowed in concentration. The humans pushed their advantage through the planet's formidable defenses. Most of the Sovereign's heavy weaponry had long been redirected to failed assaults on the blockade. Now Syraxis Prime stood almost perilously isolated. For hours, the skies above the fortress world burned with weapons fire. Rashgahar's forces had fought with terrifying resolve, throwing wave after wave of interceptors and drones into the teeth of the human barrage. Even as the planetary shields wavered, anti-orbital lasers continued to rake the incoming vessels with scorched beams. But the humans' new disruptor cannons, fitted to specially modified capital ships, dealt crippling blows to generator hubs, gradually unraveling the shield net. Once the shields went down, the killing blow came quickly. Orbital drop pods cascaded from the heavens, carrying elite servitors of the angels into the spires of the fortress. Gunfire erupted across hallways hewn from black basalt. Human boarding parties pressed the attack behind cover from their aerial gunships, flushing out the entrenched defenders. Detonations of mortar reverberated in the ramparts. Syraxis Prime's militia fought with the fanaticism of those who thought defeat was worse than death, but sound tactics and better planning won the day. Within one turn of the world, the fortress gates lay shattered and the sovereign garrison had thrown down their arms in garrison. The fall of Syraxis Prime sent ripples throughout the vast empire. The critical bulwark had been breached, a supposedly impregnable one, further demoralizing any holdout loyalists. More worlds started to announce that they would either back down from the High Conclave or declare open defiance of it, hoping to avert similar ends. For centuries, the sovereigns had dominated through the illusion of invincible strength. Now that illusion was irrevocably shattered. On the bridge of the Resolute Dawn, Admiral Holt processed a priority message received from the leadership of the Earth authorities. Her orders were crystal clear: move toward Arith Beta and bring about a final reckoning. Human and allied commanders spoke in firm tones, certain that the moment for aggressive action had come. The great blockade that had left the Empire paralyzed for so long had become a thrust that would bring the Sovereign's mastery toppling down from within. Privately, Holt shared her mixed feelings with a trusted lieutenant. "I understand and know this is what needs to happen," she said, her voice quiet. "But we're about to unleash the war and storm on their capital. Civilians will be made to pay. Custom-made data set. The galaxy has not experienced a siege like this one we're about to perform." The lieutenant solemnly shook his head, reflecting a feeling that many in the fleet expressed. Victory maybe would come at the cost of choices that weighed on their consciences. Still, the path was set. New waves of human warships surged into freshly cleared corridors, methodically sweeping aside the isolated sovereign stragglers. Refineries, shipyards, and their satellite defenses came fully under human control or were destroyed if they were a direct threat. Then, with each success, the blockade's outer lines clustered tighter still, preventing any last-second reinforcements from beyond the borders of the Empire. At long last, the road to Arith Beta was open. The remnants of the Sovereign's fleets had gathered there, constituting a desperate final stand. Yet intelligence indicated the High Conclave's forces stood on the verge of mutiny, their faith in Vos Thaladris on the decline. Propelled by equal parts pride and panic, the alien warlords either mustered for a last stand or considered defection. Meanwhile, the resolute Dawn and her sister ships flying onward, intent on closing this chapter of galactic history. As humanity's fleet pressed selected balls of hydrogen toward the Empire's center, the blockade only became itself a fugue, a monolithic perimeter ward, an unbreakable ring that still braced the galaxy from within. Now the focus was really on subjugation or forcing the sovereigns to yield. No more illusions of retreat or hidden aces for the Empire. Not the humans had spent decades preparing for just this moment, gathering courage and unity. Now, on the cusp of triumph, they would not be denied. The final confrontation was almost upon us. A single deadly strike on Arith Beta could free the galaxy from generations of subjugation in an instant, or release a cataclysm if the sovereigns decided to incinerate their own capital instead of capitulating. Any outcome would alter the cosmos forever. As Siraxis Prime fell and friendly fleets no need to track dwindled, here's what Admiral Holt sent as a terse directive through secure channels towards every officer in the blockade. Get ready for the endgame. The Sovereign's final defense approach, and the upcoming war would decide the fates of billions. Sure, in its death, the Empire was still a formidable adversary, but the humans advanced, steeling themselves with every breath, nudging their shoulders with the hopes of the oppressed, with the burden of the future. The largest siege of recorded history was about to hit a crescendo, and neither side could pull back now. The voyage to Arith Beta was deceptively quiet, as if the galaxy was just catching its breath before the last act of a heartbreaking opera. In the aftermath of the fall of Siraxis Prime, scattered sovereign defenders melted away, unwilling or unable to offer meaningful resistance. Pale suns illuminated the wake of the human armada, throwing long shadows over worlds that once sported the Empire's marquess. Now, those worlds gazed inward, unsure whether to pray for deliverance or prepare for retribution. As the resolute Dawn and its sister ships approached the Imperial capital, the blockades behind them tightened further. Corral fleets sealed any gaps in the perimeter, leaving no surprise threat to flank humanity from the outside. Admiral Cassandra Holt had been heartened by their progress, but taking Arith Beta would not be simple. It was the homeworld of the Sovereigns, the pulsing center of an empire that had ruled the galaxy for hundreds of years. If there was any place Vos Thaladris would make a last, crushing stand, it would be here. Initial scans showed a variety of exotic defenses surrounding Arith Beta. Huge orbital stations armed with energy cannons, missile batteries, and fighter bays. Below them, the planet itself glimmered, swept in cityscapes that covered whole continents and guarded by an atmosphere of layered shielding with ground-to-orbit weapon emplacements. Perhaps if the Sovereigns were on the verge of a total collapse, there'd be some clue in these last bastions, but there was none. As such, a ring of dreadnoughts, damaged, but still capable of both combat and maneuver, awaited any potential intruders. Holt had been warned by advisors that the Empire would probably use planet-cracking weaponry rather than submit to its enemies. Still, the human high command forged ahead. They had come too far to go back. Warships gathered into fleets or maneuvering battle groups, each set to cover a specific sector of the planet's defenses. Troop transports waited behind the lines, ready for the possibility of planetary invasion if bombardment alone wouldn't be enough to break the Empire's will. Medical ships trailed in their wake, poised to treat the inevitable casualties. Spaceships formed the composite body of the operation as it moved, an enormous organism running towards Arith Beta, vessel and soldier alike knowing exactly where it had to be when the moment came. That moment came at local dawn on the capital world. The alarm sirens blasted their wailing across the gleaming skyline of Arith Beta as the fleets of humanity's blockade assault dropped from warp at the planet's high orbit. The sovereigns instantly opened fire. So much plasma and laser fire was rained down from orbital stations that even the vacuum itself glowed. Human battleships responded by hammering shield generators and station hulls with ballistic slugs and guided warheads. The sound of cannons roaring and energy beams crackling met in an unholy chorus. Adept above the planet's day side, debris seas swirled as stations evaporated in withering crossfire. Fighters and bombers darted between capital ships tangled with puddles of alien interceptors and dogfights. Each skirmish risked descending into chaos, but Admiral Holt's careful planning kept the line intact. She ordered squadrons to detach from the main battle, drawing the Sovereign's defensive fleets out of the pits and exposing seams in their orbital array. Hours into the bombardment, human disruptor cannons found the cracks in several critical orbital defense platforms and sent them spiraling down in fiery arcs towards the planet's surface. Yet the Sovereigns were unwilling to budge. Fortress stations hidden behind Arith Beta's moons turned toward the invaders. Their weapons raked the human flanks, and entire groups of cruisers had been forced to retreat and regroup. Long-range sensors had detected unusual energy signatures, signs, perhaps, of experimental superweapons the Sovereigns had long kept held in reserve. Whenever a new threat arose, the blockade fleets reformed, scarred but unbeaten, their discipline a jarring juxtaposition against the anarchy that now ruled among the Empire's defenders. Meanwhile, on the surface of Arith Beta, Overlord Vostaladris made his first public appearance since the blockade began. Dressed in ceremonial armor adorned with centuries of victory medallions, he ascended a grand balcony above the capital city. It was his voice, carried in signal by broadcast towers, reverberating through the streets above and leaching into orbit, open channels for all to read, every sovereign and human frequency exposed. "They come for us in our darkest hour," he roared, eyes flashing with indignation. "They blockaded us like robbers in the night, intending to deprive the sovereigns of our birthright. We will teach them the danger of trapping a lion. Arith Beta will stand defiantly forever, or it will be our glorious tomb." His speech set off a last rally among his loyalists. On the orbital stations, shattered officers steel themselves to die fighting to the last. Civilians in the capital hunkered down in sublevel shelters, unsure if Vostaladris' call to arms was sufficient to delay the inevitable. Yet no one could deny the advancement of humanity's siege, even as the Overlord's words reverberated across the space. One by one, the outer ring of the planet's orbital defenses ceased their preparations until only the innermost fortress ring around the capital itself remained. Admiral Holt remained grim and silent as Vostaladris' broadcast played. She was aware of the risk of confronting a foe with nothing to lose. But she also felt that this hesitation now would only make the slaughter drag out. With unsettling calm that belied the tension inside her gut, she authorized the final dumpster fire push. Orchestrated pushes from multiple directions with exact knowledge of visual overlaps and ownership, their collective hope being that the last strongholds would be overloaded, collapsing together and taking Gozer with them. Davids leapt forward as one, each class of ship unloading wave after wave of missiles that crashed against the Sovereign's shields in a cacophonous assault. In reply, one radiant ray shot lancing from the North Pole of Arith Beta. It sliced through the emptiness with surgical accuracy, creating a glistening molten wound in the hull of a human carrier. The mighty vessel erupted in a violent gout of flame and creaking metal. The origin of the pulse was identified moments later by sensor scans, an ancient planetary defense grid long thought capable of star-killing blasts, triggered in an act of desperation. Each officer aboard the Resolute Dawn knew that if such a weapon could be recharged quickly, the entire fleet could be decimated. Time was critical. Admiral Holt dispatched a strike team to slip through the orbital firefight and disable this superweapon. Stealth corvettes guiding a small flotilla of drop ships plunged into the planet's atmosphere under heavy fire, timing their splash-to-planet run to the recharge cycle of the weapon. On the surface, they discovered an enormous, alien-designed structure, a remnant of one of the Empire's earliest backwater conquests. There was fighting along catwalks and conduits that crossed the weapon's power channels. Sovereign zealots, some pistol-packing morons, defended it with manic fervor and blasted away at the human strike team. Casualties soared as the humans pushed in corridor by corridor, overriding security systems and laying charges as they went. The ominous drone of the superweapons bank of capacitors had grown deafening, a sign of near completion in their recharge. But at the last second, a member of the demolition team managed to trigger the main power conduits, setting off a chain reaction that blew the weapon apart from the inside. From orbit, a mushrooming explosion shattered the polar region. The planet's secret doomsday device fell into ruin. Every sovereign channel trembled at the shock of such an event. Vastaladris, who had pinned his hopes on the device as his trump card, responded with incredulous horror. The coordinates he provided for a second firing solution, widely believed to be targeting the Resolute Dawn itself, were now useless. In a rage, he ordered his personal guard to gather for a last stand at the High Conclave's fortress spire. Above, the shattered remnants of the sovereign orbital fleets were starting to splinter. Others' warships kept fighting, dropping shields and powering down weapons. Others, gripped by fear or blind loyalty, fought on in scattered pockets. Regardless, the unity that formerly defined the Empire's power was forever ruptured. In a burst of adrenaline to catch their opening, humanity's capital ships rained concentrated fire on the remaining defensive platforms, splitting them wide open in bursts of dazzling light. Finally, the road to Arith Beta's surface lay open. Admiral Holt studied the situation and concluded that a planetary landing was inevitable. From his palace spire, Vastaladris clearly intended to fight to the death. Obliterating the whole metropolis from orbit was neither strategically necessary nor morally palatable. Humanity required a definitive victory that would close the lid on the Empire without mass devastation of civilian life. And so, the assault shuttles and drop pods once more blazed through the atmosphere in a precisely synchronized descent, filled with Marines, combat mechs, and infiltration teams. Pockets of resistance erupted in the capital's streets, but most of the city appeared cowed or apathetic, as if anticipating the Empire's coming collapse. Human units confidently moved step by step along these barricaded boulevards, high-tech drones sweeping ahead to scout every block. Seemingly impregnable walls buckled in synchronized bombing runs. Panicked citizens fled to shelters or emerged waving white flags fashioned from ripped cloth, in no position to resist the newcomers who had broken the siege that once held the galaxy in chains. Above the city's human heart, up an obsidian spire that stabbed into the amber heavens, Vastaladris waited for humanity to come. Encircled by the last remnants of his elite guard, he scowled at the advancing soldiers with a look of both hatred and resignation. Lost was the booming voice of triumphant conquest. Now he just held his ceremonial weapon, refusing to bow, but with no fantasies that he could still win the day. When Admiral Holt met him in person, a hush descended over the wreckage-scarred courtyard. The Overlord, in decorated armor, the Admiral, in battle-worn fatigues, whose eyes met. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, with a voice hoarse from loss, Vastaladris rasped, "You would shatter our empire. For what? Power? Vengeance?" Holt's response rang out loud and clear, audible to every spectator, blasting across open channels to the scarred survivors of sovereign forces that had managed to cling to life all throughout the system. "We broke it so no one else ever has to be under its heel. We're doing this for freedom, Overlord. Ours and everyone else's." Vastaladris's weapon fell to the ground. All around them, the sovereign guards dropped their arms. In that moment, the last embers of the mighty empire guttered out, snuffed by a single decision. In orbit, the human fleets were informed. The last garrisons on the planet had surrendered. The blockade, which had once been an intractable ring of warships, had become a steady sentinel, monitoring a galaxy that had just seen the improbable fall of its greatest power. So concluded the day when humanity encased an entire empire in its own land and brought it to its knees. Among the broken remnants of Arith Beta's colossal spire, the Overlord's surrender was not merely the collapse of a despotic ruler. It was also the birth of a new era, an order where the once subjugated races could roam freely, and the cosmic order of dominion would never be the same. The Empire's pennants, once hung in every quadrant in the galaxy, lay tattered and trampled in the shattered streets of Arith Beta. The surrender of the Overlord quickly spread, transmitted by human broadwaves, cross-talked over broken subspace relays. In the loneliest reaches of sovereign space, governors and admirals pledged obedience or faded into irrelevant history. World by world, the Empire unraveled, creating power vacuums and the first hints of freedom where people had long endured subjugation. On the resolute dawn, Admiral Cassandra Holt called a final debriefing. There remained much to be done. Human forces would have to keep the peace until stable governance could be put in place, and not all of the sovereign officers were ready to accept reality. Yet there was triumph in the air. The blockade that had once encircled the Empire was now a protective screen, flushing out outside opportunists who might rush in to profit from the chaos. Allied ships loaded with relief supplies and medical teams fanned out across the worlds once under the yoke of their oppressors, determined to show that there was a reason humanity had fought, but it was not for conquest. It was for deliverance. In the midst of Arith Beta's shattered spires, Holt saw an imperfect peace taking hold. Families emerged from underground shelters to stare up at the smoke-choked sky, bristling with human warships keeping a watchful orbit. Refugees from the Empire's forced labor programs with hollow, sunken eyes staggered into daylight, unsure whether to mourn the millions of dead or celebrate the Empire's demise. Some, embittered by centuries of abuse, had demanded immediate trials for the sovereign warlords. Others longed for a moment's pause to digest the enormity of change. Holt backed through a blackened barricade, and then found Overlord Voss the Ladris guarded, his previously gleaming armor scratched and dulled. He could not spare his remaining high conclave. The scars of failure marred every flick of his serpentine features. In low tones, he asked Holt one question: "What happens to us now?" She responded softly, saying the Trials and Reconciliation Councils would determine the fate of the Empire. He had no response, but the shadow that passed across his face made it clear that, somehow, he had started accepting the new order he long believed impossible. The news of the Empire's fall sent ripples across the stars. Species that had quaked before its military forces for eons rejoiced. Others, who had already relied on trade or were forced into pacts, considered the instability of a galaxy without its core strength. Many extended their hands to humanity, inviting them to partner or at least offering to help expand their knowledge of how an upstart race had accomplished what had been the unthinkable. Evernight embassies were formed and universal translators whirred with mix of languages reflecting relief and hope and the occasional touch of trepidation at humanity's burgeoning voice. Back on the resolute dawn, Admiral Holt and her officers contemplated the incredible journey. They had prepared for every contingency, though witnessing the end of such a vast empire was beyond any computer simulation. Crew members wept openly, recalling the sacrifices made to reach this day. Others stood at attention, stirred to recall the fragility of victory. The success of the blockade was merely the first act. Now the challenge of creating a lasting peace remained. In a sober ceremony visible on human and alien channels alike, the blockade's accomplishments were celebrated. Crews from the farthest flung corners of Earth's colonies saluted the fallen as they passed by in combat. Allies who once fell under the sovereign's lash stepped forth again, some hoisting battered flags and emblems of worlds that had never tasted liberation. Here, at the epicenter of what had once been the galaxy's most potent empire, a new age appeared poised to begin, an age of mutual enterprise, rather than military conquest. The last gesture was when man lowered its weapons against Arith Beta. Instead of the Empire's frayed pennants, relief ships and medical frigates descended to tend to the wounded and hungry. The blockade didn't stay a prison at the Empire's borders as a prison, but an angel, allowing neither the encouragement of the exploitation to slide into another bloodbath nor the chaos. With tightly controlled protocols, the first openings were for diplomatic envoys, lines of communication, not escape routes for an aggressor. Through it all, the memory of that one day lingered. The day when all of humankind wrapped a whole galaxy around itself like a net and locked its most powerful empire inside. Many would recall it in the pages of interstellar history as the most daring maneuver ever witnessed, evidence that resolute strategy could bring down the mightiest despot. Others would remember the bravery of the countless souls, both human and alien, who had worked to end the cycle of terror at the cost of their own lives. At dusk on Arith Beta, Admiral Holt and a few of her officers ascended the shell of a broken palace tower. Starlight streamed across the hushed capital. From this vantage, they could glimpse the swirl of warships, now more like watchful sentinels than doomspellers. Towering below them was the city, bruised but breathing. The blockade had done its job. The Empire had fallen, and hope was waiting to be rebuilt amid the towering ruins. They dominated the galaxy for eons, conquering, degrading, convinced of their invulnerability, until humanity locked away all options and brought down their empire in a single day. What started as a siege transformed into a revolution, a testament to unity and resolve. The blockade is still there, a mute testament that even the fiercest of enemies can be trapped, even conquered, when a resolute people will not submit. A new chapter in galactic history has begun, written in the darkness of the fallen empire, one overseen by humanity and directed by bravery, not fear.